Before we do that though, I think it's worth kind of visualizing 2.4 and below how the basic model worked, right? So if you had, say this is your database, and you can have multiple databases inside a MongoDB. So we have, this is your MongoDB instance, and let's make the admin database nice and noticeable. So the admin database is down here somewhere. There we go. And this is just any other database, right? So essentially what you could do prior to 2.6 was you wanted to add a user to this database so they could do operations on that particular database. You added a user in here, and as I think Dwight explained in 102, there's a system.users collections for each database. So you added a user in here and decided what it could do. So you know, it could be read only, or it might have read write. Might be able to add users. You know, there's various different things that you can do in the context of a particular database, and you would add all of these permissions in the context of that particular database, and that's the only thing you would then have access to. If this user wants to sort of break out of this context and access another database over here, or a smaller database, let's say, then you have two choices. One, you can add the user in here and reproduce or change that user's permissions. So that's one way you could go about doing that. So that now means you have to maintain that user in both places. Or if you've decided that this user needs to have access to in multiple contexts outside, you may decide to put the user over here on the admin database and give them access to everything. But you can see easily, so you might say, well, I only wanted to give him access to 6 of my databases. I have 300, so it doesn't make sense to put him over here. But having to add a user to 6 databases and maintain it is kind of clunky. That seems strange. Why do I have to do that? So even just within a single MongoDB, you can kind of see how this might become painful to manage, right? With lots of databases, lots of users, and lots of different needs in terms of their access to a particular database. So already you can kind of see the sort of the clunkiness of this model and some of the headaches that you might have in terms of maintaining this. It also leads to some sort of surprising things, right? Because this user, which we haven't moved anywhere else yet, so let's say that these things have not yet actually happened, only exists in this database. There's a couple of things that this user can't do, regardless of what permissions we give him here, right? So for example, there's no way to say give him access to list databases. So the list databases command won't work for that user. Why is that? Well, that's outside the context of this database. That's, if you like, it's somewhere in here, right? The context for the list databases command is somewhere in here in the MongoDB. It's across multiple databases. You're asking for the names of multiple databases that exist in this MongoDB instance. So the permissions don't allow you to break out of this context right here. So that's kind of how to think about it. When you add a user to a specific database, that's all you are adding them to. You can't use those permissions anywhere else. So in one way, it's nice and secure. You don't have information leakage. You don't have things like that. But it's also quite inconvenient because you can't run list databases. So imagine this user has access to, let's say you have 300 databases on a single MongoDB instance. You add a user to 30 of them, 30 DBs. So you add a user to the 30 databases, but the user has no way to list all 30 databases because listing the databases is an all or nothing thing. You can either see them all or you can't. So to do that, you actually have to add the user in here into the admin database. So for list databases, you need to add the user as a cluster admin in the admin database, which then of course gives them much more access as well. So there's far more commands available in cluster admin than just list databases, but that is the level of permissions that you actually need there. You can see why some of these decisions were made, and you can see how some of the challenges that they throw up from particularly a shared database model where you've got lots of users and lots of databases. So it can lead to complications, most definitely. In 2.2, it's a little bit more straightforward. You don't have all these roles, but it's basically the same concept, right? You're going to have permission outside the context of a particular database to do certain things. So 2.4, it certainly became a little bit more opaque as to what you'd actually need. Most people wouldn't think you'd need cluster admin to run a list databases command, but that is how it is shaken out. The nice thing is that we actually have pretty decent reference documentation on this. So this page is user privilege roles in MongoDB for 2.4. So as you can see the notes added in 2.4, it goes through some of the changes that have been made. It also tells you how to turn off backwards compatibility with 2.2. So this was left in so that any users that you've added in 2.2 will actually still work, but you can actually turn off that compatibility and only allow users that have been added in 2.4 with the appropriate roles. So that's a nice little note to know about. The user roles, what we do here is we list each role, and then we give a list of the commands that that role gives you access to in that particular context. Right. So the first thing we start off with is database user roles. Right. Roles specific to a given database. So this read, this is basically your read-only role. And you can see various things, kind of sort of stuff you'd expect. You can do your various query commands. You can count things. You can run an aggregate, collection stats, all the stuff within the context of that database. It doesn't require a write lock, essentially. Then you've got your next step up, where you've got read-write. So this one you're actually allowed to do write operations such as insert, remove, and update, as well as things like drop. Obviously, because that requires a write lock to drop the database. Dropping indexes, you do a find and modify, map reduce, where you're outputting to a collection. If you're doing the map reduce with the output in memory, you don't need this because you don't require a write lock. But if you're doing it output to a collection, you need the write lock to actually be able to output somewhere. And sort of this is what you would expect. Now we go on to the database administration roles. So these are the ones that will be added to the database but give you an administrative type access specific to that database. So this is not being added to the admin database itself. This is still a database local role, if you like, but it's giving you some of the admin privileges on that particular database. And you can see there is some overlap at read-write here, so you've got a drop option, drop indexes, so there is some duplication with the read-write. There's a couple of things that you can do here that you can't do. So for example, here's the read-write list, pretty short. Here's the admin list. So you can see things like validate, can't do that without having admin access. Compact, I believe, is similar. And interesting enough, dbadmin has the ability to read the system.profile collection. So if you're doing profiling, you're turning on the profiler and actually want to analyze things, you have to have this dbadmin role. So again, that might be something that escapes people. They might think, well, I've got read access, why can't I see the profiler? So there you go. You have to have a dbadmin role to be able to access the system.profile collection. And then you have the concept of a user admin. And specifically, this is for adding other users into that particular database. Right. So because user admin has access to the roles that a user can have, it's effectively a super user role for a specific database. And here's that note here, because you can grant yourself all of the privileges we've just gone through above. So if you're not a DB admin, but you are a user admin, you can make yourself a DB admin. You can make yourself read-write if you're read-only. So user admin sort of confers the power to make your own user anything you want, and therefore gives you that sort of super user access within the context of a database. So be careful with the user admin role. Certainly one to control access to tightly. Now, after that, we move on to the specifically administrative roles, right? And these cluster admin is the one I mentioned, where if you want to list databases, all databases on a particular replica set or cluster, you are required to have the cluster admin privilege, cluster admin role, excuse me, which grants the required privileges. And in this case, it only applies to the admin database. There you go. So cluster admin is only applicable in the admin database. It doesn't grant access to local or config databases. There's the list of commands that you can then run, quite a large list. And then there's sort of the final class of roles. And again, good reference documentation here. So you can always refer back to this. You've got the any database roles. And this is getting more similar to how things are in 2.6. Right, except that you can be a little bit more specific, right? So in this case, provide users with the same read-only permissions as read, except it applies to all logical databases in the MongoDB environment, right? So instead of having to grant to 300 separate databases, if that's how many you have, you can say you've got read-only access to all 300. Ditto for read-write any database, and ditto for user admin any database. Of course, this essentially makes you a super user across all logical databases. But you can see if we go back to our little diagram here, that you've essentially, in this scenario with your 300 databases, you can say you can have access to all of them. What you can't do is say you've got access to 30 of them. So if you do only want to give someone access to 10%, it's a little bit of a problem. You've got to add 30 separate users. If you want to give them access to all 300, that's actually quite easy to do. So there you go. I would recommend when you're rolling this out, when you're configuring your users, always have this page handy, the user privileges page, so you can refer back and confirm your suspicions. Even after doing this multiple times myself, drawing this out in a whiteboard for people, giving training on it, I will occasionally get these roles slightly confused in terms of what permissions are required for what operation. So a very good piece of reference documentation to keep in your bookmarks here for future reference.